I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, last week's historic Supreme Court decision making the right of gays to marry in any state of the Union American law. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that states are constitutionally required to permit and recognize marriages between members of the same gender. Well, much of the non-Orthodox community is supportive of gay marriage. Both the Reform Movement's Rabbinical School, the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, and the Conservative Movement's Rabbinical School, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, have accepted openly gay students and have ordained openly gay students as rabbis. And more Reform and conservative rabbis are willing to officiate at gay weddings. In the Orthodox Jewish community, there remains serious opposition to ordaining gay rabbis and to condoning gay marriage. Agudath Israel of America issued a statement in response to the Supreme Court ruling, reiterating its commitment to the laws in the Torah which expressly forbid homosexual relationships. It is a capital crime in the Torah. The Agudath Israel statement distinguishes between respecting people who are gay and a policy of condoning homosexuality. Their statement reads in part, "We reject the voices of those in the heterodox Jewish community who claim that same-sex marriage is compatible with Jewish law and tradition. The issue here is not whether all human beings are created in the divine image, or whether they have the inherent human dignity, or whether they have inherent human dignity. Of course they are, of course they do. The issue is whether the Torah sanctions homosexual conduct or recognizes same-gender unions. It does not." The Agudath Israel statement also echoes a fear that many have in the Orthodox community, namely that those who believe homosexuality is immoral will become social outcasts and will come under pressure from those who support gay rights and even perhaps suffer some forms of public discrimination. Well, for comment on the Supreme Court decision, I'm very pleased to welcome back to JBS the Director of Public Affairs for Agudath Israel, Avi Shafran. Avi Shafran, of course, is a rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi, and he represents the thinking of Agudath Israel. Avi, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Mark, as always.
Okay, Avi, you've heard my open. Do you want to amplify in any way the position that Agudath Israel is taking? And Avi, your organization chose to make a public statement. What's the goal of the statement? And again, how do you respond in general to the Supreme Court decision?
Well, you did a very good job of picking out the most poignant part of the statement. The reason that it was necessary to make a statement is simply because the impression that the public has, because of the reactions of all the other Jewish movements, as well as the reaction of at least 13 Jewish organizations who signed on to an amicus brief in favor of the proposition of extending marriage to same-sex couples. That leaves the impression on the public of the fact that Judaism condones homosexual acts. That, of course, is not true. At least Jewish religious tradition, as it's been handed down to us over the generations, over the millennia, takes a very strong negative approach to homosexual actions, not homosexuality, that is to say, not the inclination toward homosexual acts, but rather the acts themselves, whether committed by a homosexual or a heterosexual. But in any event, the Jewish tradition also includes opprobrium for the official legalization and endorsement of homosexual unions, at least male ones. And because those are things that people are either not aware of or choose to overlook, we feel that part of our mandate as a leading national Orthodox Jewish organization is to at least state the facts of the matter, even as we take note of the shifting sands of the societal mores.
Yes, and it is amazing, Avi, how much the sands have in fact shifted. And I am not critical of the movement. I am just at the same time aware that the movement has been very dramatic in a very short period of time. In a very short period of time, people who were very much against gay marriage, or using the word marriage for what had been called gay unions, that's changed. It includes, of course, the President of the United States, and there was a dramatic shift in his public statements, which now support gay marriage. But Avi, it seems to me that the overwhelming sentiment in the non-Orthodox world is that in some way the gay couple has every right to live their lives in civil America, in secular law, the way a heterosexual couple would. And one of the things that
and there's no doubt either about the unbelievable speed with which this particular societal sea change has taken place in the whole Western world, and not just the United States. It's indeed a very impressive, whether positively or negatively impressive. It's definitely an impressive achievement, and it speaks to a lot of different factors. But as I say, the role, as we see it, of Jews is to emulate our forefather Abraham, who was called the Ivri, the other sider. Because he was called that, our tradition explains, because he wasn't afraid to take a stand for the truths of God and the Torah, even when the rest of the world remained on the opposite side of the divide. So we recognize that there will be an overwhelming amount of pressure put on people, including ourselves, with regard to this recent decision's fallout. And we are simply girding ourselves to stand strong and to maintain what we believe to be the Jewish mandate and the Jewish religious tradition.
Yes. I want you to speak for one moment, Avi, to the larger issue. There's a real difference between an Orthodox perspective on Jewish law and Jewish life and what I now see as the non-Orthodox. It's not about a Reform, conservative, or Reconstructionist. It seems to me that throughout Jewish life today, there are two ways to look at the Torah. The Orthodox movement has a Sinai perspective that the Torah comes directly from God, even in its interpretation. The interpretation is God-given as well. And then there is the Jewish community, which at the moment numbers more than the Orthodox, although I don't think it's fair. Numbers really are irrelevant here. There is a distinction, however, there is in the non-Orthodox community a real feeling that Torah is in some way inspired by the divine, a response to the divine, and that Jewish law has over the years evolved and changed, whether it has changed in a conscious way or a less conscious way, it has changed, and that the larger issue that you face is that there are so many American Jews and so many Jews worldwide who feel that the Orthodox perspective on a Sinai Torah is no longer relevant to their lives. Now, the fact that they may think it's irrelevant says nothing about the veracity, the truth, or it should not be a determining factor. But you understand that for most Jews, and I'm now talking about committed, serious Jews, they look at Orthodoxy and say the Orthodox perspective on incorporating women into Jewish life and dealing with the issues related to gay life separate Orthodoxy from the majority view, again, of serious Jews, and put Orthodoxy on the periphery.
Well,
Avi, I'm asking you to comment on that larger issue.
It's precisely because of the serious Jews who would not consider themselves to be Orthodox Jews that we put out statements like the one that we put out, because we want them to confront, wherever that will take them, confront the sources. And even though, as you well articulated, the attitude toward the Torah as not God-given in the traditional sense, but as inspired, is one that lends itself to essentially no bounds of reinterpretation. If there's anything that's very clear in the Torah, it's that male homosexual acts are very gravely forbidden. And if one sort of imagines that out of the Torah, then there's no reason to not imagine out of the Torah any of the other precepts of the Torah, including the ethical laws and the verses that are happily quoted by non-Orthodox Jewish movements. So it's sort of like being a little bit pregnant. You know, there is a Jewish tradition that we're all heirs to, and we either accept it or reject it. And if we're rejecting it to the degree that we want to pick and choose what parts of it are pertinent to our lives and we feel are valid, and which ones we will write off as having been simply inspired at a certain moment in time but no longer apply to us, well, then there's no holding back from jettisoning the entire Torah, which no thinking Jew wants to do. So we want indeed for Jews to confront this fact. We have no animus whatsoever for people who have homosexual inclinations. I believe that, personally at least, that there's a whole spectrum of such people, some of whom it's a major part of their lives, others of whom make certain choices or at least are less overwhelmed by homosexual urges than others. I think the evidence, the sociological evidence bears that out. And there's a lot of fluidity with regard to sexuality, which is also borne out by what you see out there in the world, and even among people who are well-known, celebrities and whatnot, who at one point identified themselves as homosexuals and at other points as heterosexuals. So it's the act, not the inclination, that the Torah condemns, but to embrace the act and to say simply that it was condemned by the Torah at a particular time in an inspirational sense, but we're not bound by that. It's we believe something of a cop-out. The Torah is not silly putty. It can't be molded into one's own image. On the contrary, what our ancestors, according to our tradition, said was that we will do and we will listen, which traditionally means that our ancestors accepted the Torah sight unseen, so to speak, with a commitment to keep its laws even when they didn't sit well, even when they weren't readily understandable. And that's the position that we take today in the Orthodox community. Again, we don't insist or try to force other Jews to see things our way, but we do want them to confront the entirety of our mutual heritage and see where that leads them. It has led many non-Orthodox Jews to Orthodoxy. Yes. It may have turned off other Jews, but it is what it is in the sense that it is our mutual heritage, and we want people to confront it and think about it.
I found it very, very poignant that Agudath made reference to the fact that you're worried about how you will be treated for your beliefs, which I would like to see respected as much as those on the other side. And I want to know, what are you really worried about? What do you think could really happen to those in the Orthodox community who espouse your position, or those in America in general who simply oppose gay marriage for what they consider to be religious, moral, or biblical reasons?
Well, no one wants to be called a racist or a bigot. And I would imagine that you wouldn't call me a racist or a bigot
I would
for my
not.
Affirmation of the Torah's truth and the application of all the Torah's laws, which I don't pick and choose among. Boy, if I did, I would be living a very different life. But I don't think you would call me a bigot for that.
Correct.
And yet the constant comparisons between gay liberation and the 60s when the civil rights movement really took hold, there are constant comparisons made there, so that what it yields is a mentality that anybody who frowns upon homosexual acts is the equivalent of someone who once upon a time would not want to stand within 4 feet of a black person, and certainly would never choose to live on his block, and certainly would never think of marrying him or her. The Orthodox community never suffered from that sort of bigotry. Obviously, there have been black-Jewish friction, but that's all because of things that took place. It was never an inherent part of the Orthodox Jewish tradition. On the contrary, I know many racially intermarried Orthodox couples. and not just in recent years, but in many years back. So I think that what we are afraid of is that we're going to be perceived as the equivalent of a bigot, of a Confederate flag waver, simply because we affirm the Torah's ideal, and it's also an ideal. It's one of the seven basic laws of humankind, not just for Jews, but for non-Jews, that homosexual acts among males are gravely forbidden. We're afraid of that. We're also afraid of repercussions on the aid given that currently is given legally to Jewish schools. If there becomes, for instance, a federal anti-discrimination law that will include homosexuals as a protected category, which there's talk about, so that might very well translate into any school that preaches otherwise, that teaches otherwise, that simply teaches the Jewish tradition that's been taught for 2,000 years, could be considered to have run afoul of the Constitution and as such would not be eligible for transportation services, book services, special ed services, and whatnot. That wouldn't be the end of the world, but it would be a tremendous strain on an already financially strained community. So we are afraid of that as well. So there are many, I think, valid fears that we have, but the statement only mentions that in passing. The essence of the statement is that we are here and standing up for what Jews over the millennia stood up for, died for, were persecuted for, and no matter what society might say, and no matter what 9 justices in black robes might say, we hereby continue to affirm the Jewish religious tradition, and it's the tradition that's the heritage of every Jew.
Avi, it is always wonderful to talk to you, and despite the fact that you and I see Torah a bit differently, I always appreciate your perspective, and I appreciate your willingness to come on and discuss it with me on JBS. Thank you very, very much.
Not as much as I appreciate your inviting me to, Mark.
Thank you, my friend.
Be well. We're always friends.
Thank you. Avi Shafran, Director of Public Affairs for Agudath Israel, a very sweet man, and again, whether you agree or disagree, he always speaks in respectful terms, and he makes one think. Now, in some ways, the conservative movement is most challenged by the Supreme Court ruling and the issue of gay marriage. The conservative movement is committed to halakha, Jewish law, in a historical framework, and there are many rabbis on the more traditional end of the conservative movement who oppose gay marriage and have done so for quite some time. In fact, even though the Jewish Theological Seminary accepts gay students for ordination, the issue of gay marriage is one of the most divisive issues in the conservative movement today. So we're very pleased to have on our phones the Dean of the JTS Rabbinical School, David Nevins. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here, but my name is Daniel.
Daniel, by the way, you know what? It's written right in front of me. Daniel Nevins, I apologize to you.
It's okay.
Good to talk to you, Daniel. How are you?
Thank God I'm doing well. It's a beautiful day and an exciting time for our society.
It is.
That introduction, I appreciate, you're trying to set a context, but I'm not sure that it's, in fact, the case that there's a differentiation in views between ordination and marriage. Probably the same people who are opposed to gay ordination would be opposed to gay marriage.
Yes, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a bitterly contested subject at the moment. It's one that there are differences of opinion, but they seem to be playing a smaller role in our community right now.
You may be right, although my experience has been those who oppose moving towards gay marriage and who are not comfortable with gay ordination, they do have a degree of bitterness. They're being outnumbered and they're outvoted, and certainly, the majority of the conservative rabbinate right now is supportive of gay marriage, or gay ordination to be sure. But I'm not sure that your comment that there's no bitterness anywhere in this subject is accurate. Having said that,
I didn't say no bitterness.
Okay.
I just said that it's not a major theme right now. It sounded in your introduction like you were saying that we're really tearing ourselves apart, and it's not the case.
Okay, I agree. I take that caveat. At the same time, when the issue is up for discussion or debate, there is some very strong statements being made, and at the moment, the decision that the conservative movement made, actually the conservative rabbinate made, which says that although there is no prohibition against gay marriage, there's prohibition against gay sex inside marriage. Is that where things stand in the conservative movement today?
Yeah, I think you're making reference to a paper that I was a co-author of in 2006 with two other rabbis, Rabbi Elliot Dorff and Rabbi Avram Reisner, and the paper that we wrote on behalf of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which, although the voting members are rabbis, also has lay leadership from the United Synagogue, and it actually represents both the United Synagogue, JTS, Ziegler, and the RA, so it's a pretty broad swath of the conservative movement. And in that, we argued that while certain elements of gay intimacy are prohibited specifically in the Bible, just as certain amounts of forms of heterosexual intimacy are forbidden by the Bible, for instance, menstrual sex. So a gay couple would have certain limits on their sexual expression, but they would have certain permissions. So there's an idea, isser v'heter, of that which is forbidden, that which is permitted. And our argument was that the principle of human dignity, kvod habriot, would supersede the rabbinic level prohibitions, the lower level prohibitions against male same-sex intimacy and lesbian intimacy, even though the explicit one biblical prohibition remains intact. So a couple of gay men would have some permission and some prohibition, just like a heterosexual couple would have.
It's interesting. You want to compare prohibiting, in essence, anal sex. You want to compare that with the prohibition against a married couple having sex during a woman's menstrual period.
Well, I didn't make the comparison. Leviticus did. If you go to chapter 18, you'll see both of those listed in the same list of the arayot, the sexual prohibitions. It's actually the very same level called erva, or sort of a sexual taboo. And so any heterosexual couple that has menstrual sex is in the exact same halachic category as a gay couple that has anal sex.
Daniel, the Torah has homosexual sex between men as a capital crime. Is it a capital crime to have sex with your wife when she's menstruating?
Yep.
It's a capital crime?
Yeah, it's an erva. It's the most, if it were done, and here we get sort of technical, with hatra'ah, which is like a warning, then yes, the person could be killed. And if not, then karate, which is some sort of mysterious death by heaven.
Okay.
But yeah, they're actually the same category. So it's one of the things. There's all this animus towards gay relationships in some quarters, but it's actually the very same situation with a heterosexual couple that's not following traditional marital law in Judaism.
However, the nice thing about the laws as it applies to heterosexual couples is that when a woman is not menstruating, there's no prohibition against sexual intercourse. There's no equivalent which allows a heterosexual couple to engage in serious sexual intimacy at any point, at any time. Well,
there's some debate actually in Jewish law about what's called bia shelo kedarka, which would be anal sex between a man and a woman, whether that's permitted or prohibited.
I thought, by the way, the Talmud makes it clear it is permitted.
Well, there's one important opinion that says it's forbidden, and the Shulchan Aruch actually says it's the greatest avera that exists, the greatest sin that seems to come from Kabbalistic reasons.
Yes,
because
is that what you believe? Yes. Is that what you understand? JTS teaches out of the conservative movement that anal sex is prohibited to Jews?
We're not teaching that per se, but you asked, is there any basis for an idea that a heterosexual couple would have some sexual acts forbidden to them permanently, not just temporarily? And there is that tradition in our
yes, although again,
sources.
There are tradition. There is an element in Talmudic Judaism, which says that a couple, as long as it's consensual, can do virtually anything that they want to do. There is no equivalent in Jewish law applying to a homosexual couple.
Correct. So our argument was that our ancestors did not give any permissive rulings about same-sex intimacy. We're fully cognizant of that. But we also pointed out that our ancestors did create some very strong rules about the protection of human dignity. And what was innovative about our argument, and this is perhaps typical of conservative Judaism, is that we're willing to extrapolate from classical sources about human dignity in this case and apply them to a class of people that might not have had their dignity recognized. Mm-hmm. Remember, of course, that pre-modern humans didn't really have an idea of sexual orientation.
Exactly.
That didn't really come about until, the late 19th century. And so, when the rabbis in the Talmud talk about people having same-sex intimacy, the assumption is that these are people who are basically heterosexual and are going astray, in the way that a man who's married might have an adulterous relationship. So it's just a question of an error, a sin. But the contemporary idea that sexual orientation is a very deep part of identity, and it takes shape often before sexual experience. You have children who are beginning to realize that they're not, their gender identity is not the same as that of other kids, and their sexual orientation is different. This happens often before they've had any sexual experimentation at all.
Absolutely.
And so, this is something we're learning from the experts, the psychologists, and our paper spent quite a bit of time citing the psychological literature about this. And so what we said was, the established law, you can't deny that the established law is prohibitive, but you then have to say, if you are, maintaining that classical prohibition, what are you saying to gay people in your community? Are you saying to them that they have to be celibate forever? They have to go into these sort of brokeback marriages and sort of pretend that there's something other? We know how much suffering comes from that, both for the person who's pretending and for their spouse and children if they have them. We know that there's suicide, people in these desperate situations. So we were saying, the status quo ante is problematic from internal halachic reasoning, and it's not just some external liberal secular agenda that we're interpolating into Judaism, but we were reclaiming classical concerns of the tradition itself and saying that they need to be addressed.
I understand. Daniel, in general, what was the conservative movement's response to the Supreme Court ruling?
Well, I think that the statements that have been made by the official arms have been supportive. In fact, some of the arms joined together in an amicus brief in support of this.
Yes.
It's kind of hard to understand the case that secular law should not allow gay marriage. Yes. I understand people like your prior speaker saying they themselves don't want to perform gay marriage, and maybe he's concerned he's going to be discriminated against somehow, although I'm not sure how that would be the case. After all, I don't perform interfaith marriages, and I'm not worried that I think the government should allow me to. I just don't think I should do it as a rabbi. And I'm not terrified that I'm going to be sued by somebody because I didn't do an interfaith marriage.
There's no comparison. But he gave an excellent example, and that has to do with day schools and whether day schools will lose funding. Nobody's worried about whether a rabbi does or does not perform intermarriages. The gay marriage issue is a real issue, and it's a real issue in society. My own feeling is that the Supreme Court came down on the correct side, but I don't pretend that there are not issues associated with it. And
right. So if you have a yeshiva and it's got an employee, and your yeshiva gives health care benefits to spouses, right? Then I think your yeshiva might have to give those benefits to any spouse, whether it's a interfaith couple or a same-sex couple.
Who's objecting to that? Who's objecting to that?
No one's objecting to it.
Right.
I think that's the only case I can think of where he might have to recognize the same-sex marriage. It's only in some civil regard, like providing health care benefits.
Supposing
require...
supposing a yeshiva taught in the yeshiva that gay marriage was wrong, and that somehow the United States decided that you can't do that in a school that is receiving federal funds. That's a legitimate concern. There's nothing. No equivalent there in terms of intermarriage.
All right. Well, that'll be an interesting case to see if anything like that comes. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of paranoia that's developing about the government all of a sudden going on sort of intolerant attacks on religious liberty. I don't see that happening, but if it did happen, I would come to the defense of those yeshivas, frankly.
Yes, I would too. And you may be right. You may be right.
I'd come to the defense of them. I'd come to the defense of evangelical Christians. If they weren't allowed to teach the Bible as they understand it, that would be ridiculous.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
And it may be...
I'd be happy to have that fight.
Yes.
And be Rabbi Shafran's ally in that one.
Right. And it may be that, Rabbi Shafran Agudath is worrying about a problem that will never occur. But I don't want to ridicule his concerns, and it is not as inconceivable to me as you're suggesting, nor is it in any way comparable to the interfaith marriage situation. By the way, at the moment, what do you think is going to happen, Daniel? What percentage of the conservative rabbinate will now stand as some form of Mesader Kiddushin, as an officiant at a gay couple's chuppah?
Well, first of all, we've already crossed that bridge. In 2012, the same three rabbis, Rabbi Dorff, Reisner, and myself, we went back and we wrote gay marriage ceremonies and divorce ceremonies, for that matter. And so those have already begun to be used throughout the country and in other countries as well. And so I'm not sure that the Supreme Court ruling changes so much about our ritual behavior. It's just that now people can register those weddings, on the civil level as well. And it probably is going to continue to build the momentum for doing these.
Yes.
You said Mesader Kiddushin. We actually don't use the model of Kiddushin.
I know.
And that's not.
I know. By the way, I don't know why that's true.
Can I explain?
Yeah. But wait, let's make sure our audience understands. Mesader Kiddushin
the
here is the
model
word.
Of
let me
marriage,
Daniel, give me 1 second. Daniel, give me 1 second.
Okay, great.
The word Kiddushin refers to marriage, and it comes from the word kadosh, which is holy. And the question is, do you want to use the same nomenclature, in this instance, Hebraic nomenclature, with regards to a gay marriage, a gay wedding ceremony, that you would use for a heterosexual? In the Supreme Court model, what the Supreme Court basically said is, there should be no distinction in American law between what happens to a gay couple or a heterosexual couple. Both are married, and both marriages of either kind are recognized nationally by every state in the Union. The Jewish community has to ask itself, does it want to also make that same kind of blanket equation where a wedding ceremony of a gay couple is the equivalent of a marriage of a heterosexual couple? And when a rabbinic organization says we're not going to use the word kiddushin when it comes to gay couples, it's the secular equivalent of saying we will call gay marriages civil unions, and we will call heterosexual marriages marriages. So what?
Okay,
now Daniel, you can explain where the conservative movement is on this.
I'm so glad you said all that, because it's the opposite of the way we approach it. We've got no problem calling it a marriage ceremony, and in fact do so. The reason why we have a concern with Kiddushin is actually a critique of the traditional model of Kiddushin itself. In American law, we've already reversed the old-fashioned couverture, which was the idea that a man sort of acquires the woman and becomes her master. But we never really changed that in Jewish law. So Kiddushin is actually what a man does when he designates a woman as his wife, his exclusive, having exclusive sexual control of her. And literally, actually, in our traditional ketubah, he takes her from her father's house. So the the husband goes into the chuppah first, welcomes the woman from her father's house to his house, and for this reason, there's sort of an inherently inegalitarian element to the model of Jewish marriage, and you see it also in the divorce ceremony, where because the way the Torah writes, the Katav LaSefer Kritut, he writes her a book of divorce and sends her away. You have this unidirectional, that the man sort of controls the woman, and then he releases her, like he might release a slave. It's actually the same language. And so we said, we're already trying hard for heterosexual couples to create an egalitarian format. We have the woman not just sort of being silent in the ceremony, but saying something, a dedication of her husband. We've changed the ketubah with a few lines that sort of include her commitment to support her husband as well, not her just being a passive recipient of his property and his protection. But we said we're starting fresh, and why don't we create a model that's partnership? And we weren't basing it on a civil union. We were actually looking at the feminist scholar Rachel Adler, and we said what we want is to say that these two people, whether they're two men or two women, are entering into this marriage as complete equals. And so that's why we created a covenant between them called a Brit Ahuvim or Brit Ahuvot. And that's also why we created a dissolution document that could be unilateral on either side so that either could set the other free. It wasn't that we were trying to differentiate it from traditional marriage in the sense that it would be something lesser. Actually, we made something that we think is a bit better. And now the question in the conservative movement is, can we create for heterosexual couples something that's more comparable to what we did for gay couples, which is a true partnership model and not a hierarchical model of marriage?
Okay, let me make sure I understand. Are you saying you no longer use the term kiddushin for a heterosexual wedding?
No, I didn't say that. I'm saying that the problem with kiddushin, it's a nice word. It means holiness, like you said. But more specifically, kiddushin means designation of something for special.
You are,
right?
and by the way, the audience should know you explained it beautifully. But
Okay.
I'm only asking you what. Again, I use the word nomenclature.
Right.
What's the word you use in the conservative movement for a wedding ceremony between a man and a woman? Do you use the
I
word?
went to one last night, and it's a chatuna, and we do call it kiddushin because they did use the traditional language, Harayat Mekudeshet Li, you are betrothed to me, you are sanctified to me, the man says to the woman. So it's called kiddushin. But the problem with it is that it still sort of has the resonance of an older
I understand,
model.
and you've tried to ameliorate that. But the bottom line for the conservative movement is it is still called kiddushin. And what I'm asking you is, why wouldn't you want? And you can work out the problems. And but don't get me wrong, I appreciate the creativity here and the attempt within the conservative movement to shape the wedding ceremony to reflect more of what I would call Jewish values. It's not you're going outside the Jewish tradition, but you still use the word kiddushin. I said to you, are you going to use the same word for the homosexual wedding? And I don't understand why you wouldn't.
Well, we may be moving away from the word kiddushin in heterosexual marriage. We're not there yet, but one of our scholars in California is working on that now. And the question is, should we be moving into a partnership model, shutafut, as opposed to kiddushin? The thing is that we all like the word kiddushin. Holiness, of course, is a beautiful thing, and it's what we think of marriage as being. But it's kind of hard to get away from that hierarchical baggage that it comes with.
Okay, but that's really not what I'm asking you. I understand that you are grappling with some of the elements of the traditional Jewish wedding ceremony in which obviously it was male-oriented and there was power involved. I believe, incidentally, within the Orthodox community today, it's not how they view kiddushin, but certainly historically you are correct. Mm-hmm. I'm asking you a slightly different question. Whatever word you use, however you want to define the relationship between a heterosexual couple at the moment of their wedding ceremony, why wouldn't you use the same language for the homosexual couple?
Well, we are. We're calling it a wedding, and And
In
so
Hebrew, you're calling
right
it.
now,
Are you calling it kiddushin in Hebrew?
Right now, we are not using the term kiddushin. We're using brit ahuvim.
Okay, and I'm asking you, are you? You're, by the way, you're
still
also
a differentiation, yes.
You're a conservative rabbi, and you're a conservative rabbi, and you're a conservative Jewish leader. You stand in two shoes at the same time. At the one hand, you are representing yourself and your own perspective, and you're also representing the conservative movement. So, Daniel, for you personally, would you like to see the conservative movement find some language in which the language does not differentiate between the heterosexual couple and the homosexual couple?
Absolutely. We're on the same page there. What I'm just saying is that because there's a 2,000-year history of heterosexual marriage, and that when people get married, they tend to want to have everything be as traditional as possible. And so, right now, up until now, the conservative movement has tried to sort of edit the traditional wedding ceremony so that it has all the validity that the Talmud lays out, but it reflects a more egalitarian ethos. But what's becoming clear, and actually the gay marriage ceremony has sort of helped clarify that, is that what people really want now is true equality. They don't want sort of a couple of poetic things done to show that things are more or less equal. They want it to be more and completely equal. And so we're working on that now. It's actually kind of a funny thing that gay marriage right now is sort of seen as a bit privileged compared to straight marriage in the conservative movement, because they've got something that's a little bit nicer than what I had at my wedding ceremony, which is that, I designated my wife as consecrated to me, and then she said something more or less poetic, and we're trying to get to a more equal model for all couples.
Yes. By the way, there are wedding ceremonies where, and the audience should understand, if you go to a Jewish wedding, the most important moment is when, beginning with the groom says to the bride, Hareyat mikudeshet li, be thou consecrated unto me, b'taba'adzu kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. With this ring, it initially was a gift. The gift has become traditionally a ring, so the line has been changed to the word ring, with this ring, according to the laws of Moses in Israel. There are ceremonies, Daniel, in which the woman says the exact same thing to the man and simply changes the gender of the verb. And that is equal. I'm not sure why the conservative movement has resisted that, but that would fit the model you're trying to find.
Yeah, the problem is that just in the classical halakha, it just isn't true, and that's why it's not happening in the Orthodox world, because in the classical halakha, of course, it allows for bigamy or polygamy. So a woman couldn't designate the husband as her exclusive property because he wasn't. He could always marry a second wife, and that's why Hareyata Mikudashli sort of it goes contrary to what the classical halakha says. Of course, 1,000 years ago, Rabbeinu Gershom, prohibited bigamy for Ashkenazi Jews anyway.
So why do you even bring it up? Since unless you're by the way, everybody should understand, if you are a king, Jewish law permits you to have many wives. If you are not a king, Jewish law now forbids you, a man, to have more than one wife.
Now, in the Ashkenazi world,
there are still problems to that, because if a man does have a second wife, while he is violating rabbinic law, he is not violating Torah law.
So, look, we care about the details, but of course some of my colleagues are using the language that you're mentioning.
Yes.
I've tried to go with other language that the Talmud uses. Hareyat Ishti, the man says, you are my wife, which is also a valid form of Kiddushin according to the Talmud. And then she could say, Hareyata Ishi, you are my husband. And without that language of Mikudash, Mikudeshet, that's another way to go. If we had more time, I'd tell you a lot of the work that I've done on this. Sometimes, and actually some of my friends in the modern Orthodox rabbinate have worked on this too.
Yes.
Having the woman respond, because normally the woman says nothing in an Orthodox ceremony, and her silence is consent, shtika kehodaya dami, but it doesn't have to be that way. She could say, hey, yeah, I'll accept the ring from you and I'll be your wife. And maybe she could even go a step further and say, and here's a ring, please take it back. The classical halakha doesn't want it to be contingent, that her acceptance is contingent upon his acceptance. So that's why they're so careful to keep the women quiet. But we sort of moved past that decades ago. So traditionally in conservative weddings, the woman says, quoting from Song of Songs, Ani l'dodi v'dodi li, my beloved is mine, which is mutual language. But the problem is it's really poetic language, not legal language. And so we're working on trying to get a model which is not exactly kiddushin, it's marriage in the same way that as partnership of equals.
I appreciate the way in which you have been one of the most creative voices in the conservative movement. So I give you enormous credit. And while I love discussing this with you from a philosophical perspective, at the same time, I am very much, I'm in awe of what you're trying to do, and I hope you're successful. To the lay community, you understand, Daniel, it sounds like you can't be a little bit pregnant. And in some way, there's a feeling in the lay community, come on. And the conservative movement has taken certain stands. The easiest ones to identify are the permission for Jews to drive on Shabbat if they're coming to a service, or the fact that the conservative movement struggled for such a long time with whether there could be or could not be women rabbis, and whether women rabbis were in some way a violation of halakha and violation of Jewish law. And you, who are involved with the Law and Standards Committee within the conservative movement, you know that the initial position taken by your committee was it's absolutely impossible for there to be a woman rabbi in accordance to Jewish law. And then the reality is the committee took a different position, and you now have women rabbis who are doing fabulous work within the conservative movement. And you recently had a woman gay rabbi ordained in the Masorti movement in Israel. So, the lay community says to you, you're really worried about the nuance of Harei Ata Mikudash Li. If a woman says, be thou consecrated to me, you think that you're worried that somehow you're violating Jewish law because the man could technically have a second wife in some bizarre situation, and therefore to protect the authenticity of the statement that she can't separate a man from other women because he could become a polygamist according to Torah law, even though he can't be from rabbinic law.
You're building yourself up into a bit of a frothy.
No, it's just the conservative movement is in a pretzel.
We're in the business of being really thoughtful. We try to be thoughtful, and as we listen to our contemporaries, we try to be thoughtful as we interrogate our texts. We try to balance between submission, which is a very important part of Judaism, and assertion, which is a very important part of Judaism, between justice and mercy, between authenticity and rootedness in the past and relevance to the present. And that's the challenge. And you know what? Yeah, sometimes it takes us a couple of years to argue things out. I'm thankful for that. I think if we were to make radical decisions without any period of reflection and debate, then we'd be the poorer for it. And Judaism's we're an old tradition. A lot of the changes that happened in Judaism occurred over the course of centuries, and we sometimes complain it took us 5 years to make that decision. Well, actually, in the course of a 3,000-year history, that was kind of quick. And if you look at the change on gender and sexuality in just the last few decades, both in American society and Jewish, it's kind of remarkable how fast things have moved.
You're absolutely right. It has been breathtakingly fast, much faster than the Jewish tradition has traditionally moved. All right, So I sum it up this way. You just heard Rabbi Shafran talk about the fact that, look, he's not against homosexuals as individuals. He respects them as individuals. at the same time, the Torah says homosexuality is forbidden, and therefore he is not about to do anything that would in some way sanction gay marriage. And for him, he's disappointed that the Supreme Court ruled the way it ruled. There is, at the same time, those who are celebrating within the Jewish community. Mm-hmm. And so I'm asking you, number one, are you celebrating the Supreme Court's decision? And knowing that, bottom line, homosexuality is a capital crime in the Torah, what do you say the Jewish people's attitude should be for, on the one hand, preserving and loving and embracing the Torah, and at the same time moving forward in the conservative movement?
So, first of all, I only heard the end of his talk, so I don't really want to comment on what he said. But yes, I absolutely celebrated the Supreme Court's decision, and even if I accepted your second statement that homosexuality is forbidden in the Torah, which I don't, one particular act is forbidden in the Torah. Homosexuality, of course, is an identity that was not described in the Torah. You could, by your reasoning, you could say heterosexuality is capital crime in the Torah also because of what I described earlier. But so I celebrate it. I celebrate it as an American. I celebrate it as a Jew. I believe in people should have the right individually to make their own decisions about who to love and who to marry. And even though, for instance, I don't perform interfaith marriages, I certainly, as an American, think that people should be allowed to marry across religious lines, just like racial lines or and so on, as an American. But that doesn't mean that in my own religious practice I'm going to do everything that's permitted by American law. I might walk home, I'll pass 20 non-kosher restaurants. I celebrate that they're allowed to be here, even though I don't eat in them. And I feel that way as well here. So as you know, based on my own work with my colleagues and with the support of a majority of the law committee, I was able to argue that human dignity is a core theological and halachic principle of Judaism. And because of human dignity, we need to make space for gay and lesbian Jews to live full lives. And although there are some prohibitions that remain for them, just like there are ones that remain for me as a straight Jew, they should have full access to marriage, to leadership roles, including being rabbis. And the fact that they now can across this country is a cause for celebration.
Daniel, you are eloquent, and it's wonderful the way you are grappling with the issues. And I hope one day to get you in studio and we'll talk longer, but I appreciate your giving me so much time and letting me push you, and you're really wonderful. And just kol hakavod to you. Just keep up the good work.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being on this show with you.
Thank you so much. Daniel Nevins, the Dean of the Rabbinical School of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, the Conservative Movement's Rabbinical School. If you've been watching JBS and you've been watching L'chaim and you hear me, you know that I've been taking the position that a traditional Jew, not a Torah Jew, but a traditional Jew who embraces Jewish values and understands what, as Daniel kept talking about, the dignity of individuals. And Rabbi Shafran said the same thing as well. Avi Shafran said the same thing. The question is, how do you apply the concept of the integrity of the individual to this issue of gay rights and gay marriage? But I've been arguing for a long time that the reality is that when the Torah was written by human beings in response to the divine in the universe, but it is a human document, the understanding of what drove homosexuality, what drives it even to this day, was very different. They saw it as a moral choice. In the Jewish tradition, if you have a moral choice, then there are certain obligations that may be placed upon you. If, however, moral choice is not involved, if it is a matter of constitution, meaning how a person is born and what's inside them, then the Jewish tradition says you may never apply morality and moral choice to those issues. And what we've learned over time is that homosexuality is not a moral choice. It is who people are. They're born in a certain way. And again, as Daniel said, there are young children who are attracted to people of the same sex before they have any clue what that means. And if it is a matter of biological constitution, then no morality should be involved. That's a Jewish principle. And so if you're Rabbi Shafran, you believe the Torah was literally written by God. And that when God said it is forbidden for a man to lay with a man. By the way, I appreciate what Daniel Nevins is saying. I find he weakens his argument by comparing anal sex and the prohibition of men to have anal sex, which is never stated as such in the Torah. That's a rabbinic interpretation of what the verse in the Torah means when it says two men can't lay together as women. And so it's been interpreted to be anal sex. Okay, to compare that to menstrual sex between a heterosexual couple, I find he weakens his argument, and that I find it just ludicrous. And that in essence, we understand that the Torah had a view of homosexuality which we no longer share. And if that's true, the Jewish tradition should reflect that. And so I've been arguing on television, on JBS, in my own congregational work on the high holidays. I argue that the reality is that if you care about human beings and you care about people's feelings and you care about who they are inside, and if you care about the biblical verse, the Torah verse in Genesis, which I believe is the grounding of the entire Torah, it is not good for a person to be alone. And all of us are trying to find the other, the Ezer, the helpmeet, the companion, the Zug Bashamayim, the match made in heaven that fulfills us and completes us. For most of us, that Ezer, that Zug Bashamayim, is of a heterosexual nature. A man finds a woman and a woman finds a man. But the truth is there are some men and some women whose Ezer is of the same gender. And they should have every right of sexual expression that heterosexual couples do, and the Jewish community should celebrate it. And at a chuppah, a heterosexual couple and a homosexual couple should be treated exactly the same. And that's where we're moving. And the Supreme Court is helping all of us move in that direction. And so, although I recognize Rabbi Shafran's concern that he should not be discriminated against by the federal government or by society as a whole if his movement does not embrace homosexual marriage, gay marriage. For the vast majority of Americans, for the vast majority of Jews, the Supreme Court did us a service and has moved us closer to what the messianic vision is of the Jewish tradition. And those are my thoughts. You can always be in touch with me and let me know yours. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I would be happy to read what you have to say and to share it with our audience on a future edition of either In the News or L'Chaim. My thanks as always to our director, Sloan Copeland. Fabulous job on this extended edition of In the News. Serge Goldberg, our production coordinator. JBS Associate Director, Dara Golub. And the producer of this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.